Hello, Sterling Scholar judges. This is Taiji Harada for the Computer Technology subject. In this video, I will show you the process in which I use to make this artwork right here, which would be later used to make a banner. So, this looks pretty simple on the surface. Of course, it has a lot of detail and colors. But there's a lot more going on behind this image than one might think. So, I'll kind of show you what it's comprised of. Here's all the different layers that I use for my project. Alright, to begin, I'll show you my layers. So here's all the different layers that I use to make this art project, and each one of these has the different components of this image. Taking each one of these individually, we'll start where I began. So I had none of these layers previously made, so I'll just make all of these invisible. You can kind of see how each of the layers overlap and how it was used to make the artwork. And we'll start with my references that I used to make this art. So I had a couple images on my phone of where I live, which is in Laverkin, Utah, which is a really beautiful place. And I started with this image. I knew that I wanted to make some sort of artwork using this image right here. But the first problem I ran into was that this image is really dark. If I tried to use this as a reference image, I would get all of my colors wrong, and it's really hard to see. So I went into Photoshop and adjusted some of the adjustments, the color adjustments and the brightness adjustments to brighten this image up, which got me this. And then second is I wanted to have a larger image area for this art. So a good thing on this day I took multiple images of this area, and I ended up with if I can find it. I had this additional image right here, and this gives us more of the landscape to the right, and it gives us the river, which I really did want to incorporate water into this image. So I just kind of put them together, and using this hill right here, I tried to line it up with this other image so I can just continue drawing from that angle. I tried to line it up here. You can change the opacity to kind of help guide where you're at. As you see, I kind of tried to line up the hills the best I can, but not too much to where it looks off. And after I had that, I wanted to trace the background and this girl right here, who is actually a really good friend of mine. So I started with the background, where I traced where I wanted the background to be, and this also helped me better line it up. I kind of did a little bit of artistic preferences. I didn't want to do it exactly, but I wanted to do close enough to where if you looked at my art, you'd be able to recognize where it is. You can see here kind of where the lines fade into this other image. And after that, I had this really good start to the outlines for the background, which I would later get rid of because I didn't want any black lines. After I made the outlines for my background, I started making the outlines for my good friend right here. And without any of the other color, she has her own bunch of layers, but we'll get into that. So turning off a bunch of these layers, you can kind of see the steps I took. I also tried to do an outline of just her, and I kind of did the background around that. So if I turn on these reference images, you'll be able to see how that kind of lines up. So I mostly just use this image right here to trace her, because that's the only image she's in. So after I had her traced, I started with her in the artwork. This is where I wanted to start, so I can go after this. So using this image alone, I went into depth, I went into detail, and got closer. And I started with the clothes. So I want to do this color first, and since this is a layered system, a lot of like the roughness is covered up by the other layers. And I started off with the shirt and the different parts of it, and I went in and used the different colors to try to match her shirt as best as possible. And I went and did all these layers, and I slowly worked on it more and more. Certain parts that get covered up aren't as clean, of course, but that's the beauty of working on digital art, is you can cover things up really easily. So here's all the different layers that I used. I did her skin, her shirt, her backpack, and I got into her hair, which looks alright on its own, but hair is naturally transparent, which is really hard to capture in pretty much any art. So what I did was I got a finer brush tip, and for all of this artwork I used just the basic brush. And using this brush, I did all my artwork, but I reduced the size of my brush for the individual hair strands. I turned down the opacity, which makes it more transparent, and I just drew all of the individual hair strands as best as possible. And in the locations where it's not quite as perfect, I kind of just drew my own hair to make it look as natural as possible. It didn't have to match up perfectly, but I wanted it to be as close as possible. And that's how I ended up getting just this drawing of only her. And without any of the background stuff, it looks like this. After I had her all drawn out, I was able to take away that outline, so we don't have that harsh black line, and it makes it blend better and it looks less drawn, it looks more part of everything. After I had her finished, I started working on just the background. So kind of my process for this was I got the reference images again, and I started with the locations and the mountains that were furthest away. And you can see all the different layers. I started with farthest, second, third, they're all layered. Fourth, farthest, mountain, fifth. And if I slowly turn all of these on, you can kind of see my process. Since I matched the colors pretty well, it's pretty hard to see exactly what changed, but I can show you what this looks like. I started with the farthest mountain away, and I slowly got closer as I worked. They're all overlapped. So just with my brush, I went in and made it look as good as I possibly could. And just as I got close to the camera, I drew some more. These are all on their own layers, which eventually got me here. And then in the original picture, I wanted to get some of these trails in, so I also drew just simple outlines for the trails, which will just be over everything. But once I got all this colored in, I was able to work on some of the other stuff, like the ground. This is kind of just like all the basic colors that will be underneath all of the detail. doesn't look very good by itself, but with these detail additions, I think it started to look a lot better. So for these rocks, I had to go in and just draw each one of these individually. I went in and tried to match the colors the best I could, using both of my reference images, of course. You can see that in the second picture, the rocks line up a lot more with the second picture rather than the first. You can see where I kind of tried to mimic that as best as possible. And then I did the same thing for a lot of the foliage. I take away the ground layer. You can see where I tried to match the foliage as best as possible, but in a simple and artistic way. And after I had done all of that, we can turn all the layers back on. You can see that got me to this point where I had the ground completely done. And then it was time to move on to probably the best part of this artwork, the sky. Alright, the sky was pretty tricky, and I used some new reference images of pictures I actually took at the same location, but not the same day. If we go back to my reference images, some of the references I used were, let me turn off all of these other layers so you can better see the images. So here was just kind of inspiration. I just placed a bunch of images in here. I can know exactly how I wanted to do the sky. I kind of just threw them on there to see how it would all work. Here, I just kind of stretched the image to make it look how I wanted. And of course, I didn't end up going with this cloud look, but it was definitely something I could have done. I just really liked the blue and purple of this image, so I decided to go with this one for the sky. So just kind of placing it exactly where I want, and with these mountains in the background, I actually tried to line it up with the mountains in the previous references. You can see kind of there how it's the same mountain but just a little bit off. But it's close enough, and I was able to use the same image and kind of base it off the landscape itself to help line it up the best I could. So once I kind of had that, I just took away these other reference images and I turned everything else on, and I started painting over this picture to get the sky how I wanted it. Like this. So this is what it looked like beforehand, before I had done any drawing. And I wanted to match these clouds as best I could. So I just kind of went with my paintbrush tool and drew over the best I could. And I did it all on this clouds layer, which doesn't actually have like the background or the sky color itself. If I turn off my reference image, this is kind of what it looks like. It's just a bunch of white space. So after I had done all of these clouds, I went in behind them and I drew the background colors using this sky layer. And I was just able, since this cloud layer is on top, I was able to just paint underneath all these clouds I already had. And I was able to get this sun ray effect, and I think it ended up looking really nice. You can see I kind of did a radial motion, and as it went out, just made the sky darker. And this took me more than 24 hours to complete this entire project. It took quite a while, but I think it was definitely worth it. This is kind of how the final product looked, and I was able to later put it on a banner, which is pretty cool, I think. So when we started printing, I had to set up the settings on this printer, of course. I had to make sure that the media was correct, that I was using the right banner material, and that the quality or resolution was on the correct settings. We wanted it to be the medium settings, but since we could have done high quality, but since there's a lot of people in our class, we just put it up to the highest settings. And I think it's really interesting to see how it prints. This is like a huge, pretty big banner, and I'll definitely bring this in to show the judges the banner itself. I think the process is pretty cool. This is kind of what it looks like, and it took up to 7 minutes to print, but I just think it's cool how this printer head just lays the ink over and over, and it's just that precise. So I'll kind of speed it up manually, but I think the process is really cool. You have to set up all the right settings, you have to make sure it all works out, and you have to put it into the program which connects with this big printer and make sure that everything is compatible. This had to be a PDF image before we put it on, and it had to be the right size. And this is kind of what the whole printing process looked like. Kind of went in closer to show. And it just goes from bottom to top and slowly prints it out. Anyway, that's the process in which I made my banner design. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned a little bit more about me.